December 2024. Novosibirsk, Siberia. Shelter intake logs recorded 0 stray cat sightings across a city of 1.6 million people. 0. Not a handful. Not a slow trickle. 0. For generations, somewhere between 35,000 and 50,000 stray cats had lived in these streets, in the markets, the subway stations, the industrial lots. They were as permanent as the pavement. But in the span of a single winter, with temperatures crashing to -40 and record snowfall burying the city, every single one of them vanished. So why did an entire urban cat population disappear without a single disease outbreak, without a mass poisoning, without any official explanation at all? Animal control officers had no answer. Shelter workers had no answer. Residents who had fed the same cats for years stepped outside and found nothing, just silence and snow. That's not what this story's about, though, because what the camera traps on the city's edge picked up next, that's the part the scientists still can't fully explain. I'm Daniel Harrow, and what you're about to hear is one of the strangest urban wildlife events on record. This is the full arc of how a city lost something it barely noticed it had, and what moved in to fill the silence. To understand the weight of what disappeared, you need to know what Novosibirsk actually is. This isn't a small outpost. It's the largest city in Siberia, home to roughly 1.6 million people, pressed right up against the taiga on one side and threaded through with river corridors on the other. It sits at an edge, urban on one face, wilderness on the other, and for decades that edge belonged to the cats. Estimates put the stray population somewhere between 35,000 and 50,000 individuals before the winter of 2024. They weren't strays in the way most cities think of strays. They were woven into the city's functioning. They controlled rodents in the markets. They sheltered in the warmth of the metro system. Municipal complaint logs through 2023 and into 2024 averaged 200 to 300 calls per month about cats. Too many cats. Cats in the wrong place. Cats causing noise. The complaints were relentless, and they were proof of something. The cats were everywhere, constant, alive. Then the complaints stopped, not because the problem was solved, because the cats were gone. The cascading effects of that absence on rodent populations, on the city's informal ecology, on what it signalled to something much larger living just beyond the tree line, that's the thread we're pulling. And where it leads is somewhere nobody predicted. It was 2024, and Novosibirsk was disappearing under snow. Not the ordinary kind of disappearing that Siberians have long made peace with, the gentle burial of autumn. The slow, white accumulation that turns parks into silence and softens the hard edges of a city built for industry. This was something different, something that arrived in November like a wall and simply did not stop. By the second week of November 2024, meteorological stations across the Novosibirsk Oblast were recording snowfall figures that required double-checking. The accumulation that month reached 340% above the seasonal average. Let that number settle for a moment. Not 30% above normal. Not even double. 340%. The deepest single-season accumulation the region had recorded in 80 years, since records kept during the Soviet era first began capturing the extremes of a climate that has always tested the people living under it. What that looks like on the ground is not picturesque. Streets where the snowpack rises past ground floor windows, parks where the paths vanish entirely, where the tree canopy bends under loads it was never designed to carry, where the temperature at night drops far enough that exposed metal becomes dangerous to touch. The city's infrastructure crews worked around the clock. Heating pipes strained. Rooftops were cleared by hand in the outer districts because the machinery couldn't reach them. The Ob River, already vast and cold, became a white corridor stretching toward a horizon that looked like the edge of the world. And in the margins of all that, in the alleyways, beneath the market stalls, along the loading docks behind restaurants, in the crawl spaces under apartment blocks, something was happening to the city's cats. The prey that sustains a feral cat population in any urban environment is not glamorous. Rats, pigeons, sparrows, the small mammals that move through the gaps in a city's architecture, feeding on what the city wastes and reproducing fast enough to stay ahead of the things that hunt them. In a normal Novosibirsk winter, this food web contracts but holds. Rats go deeper into the building foundations. Pigeons cluster at thermal vents and grain storage sites. The cats follow and the balance persists. But 340% above average snowfall is not a normal winter. The pigeons moved inside or moved on entirely, or died in numbers that left the usual roosting spots empty. The rats retreated so far into the building infrastructure that outdoor cats simply could not reach them. The small mammals of the parks and green corridors, the voles, the shrews, the mice that tunnel through the leaf litter, were buried under a snowpack so deep and dense that hunting them became energetically impossible. A cat burning calories just to stay warm cannot afford to dig through a metre of compacted snow for prey that may not even be there. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense. The cats didn't die where they stood. That's what makes this winter different from a simple mass mortality event. When a cold snap kills urban animals, you find them. You find them under hedges and in doorways and curled against heating grates that weren't quite warm enough. Animal shelters brace for intake surges. Residents report carcasses. The city's informal death toll becomes visible in the way that death in a city always eventually becomes visible. None of that happened. The Novosibirsk Municipal Archives recorded a 60% drop in cat-related complaints during November 2024 alone. Noise complaints, feeding disputes, concerns about feral colonies encroaching on residential spaces. All of them fell off a cliff. By February 2025, the figure wasn't 60% below baseline. It was zero. Not a statistical rounding. Actual zero. No complaints, no sightings reported to city services. No calls to the volunteer networks that had spent years managing the feral population. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. The animal shelters tell the same story from a different angle. Shelter intake hit zero during the deepest weeks of winter. Not a trickle. Not a reduced flow. Zero. And shelter workers, when interviewed later, noted that this was not what starvation and cold exposure looked like. Those events produce injured animals, weakened animals, animals that are found and brought in. This produced nothing. The cats were not dying in place. They were not being found. They were simply gone, as if the city had exhaled and taken them with it. The residents who had fed the feral colonies for years, the women with their plastic bags of dry food, the night shift workers who left scraps by the dumpsters, the retired men who had named individual cats and tracked their movements for a decade. These people noticed first. They kept coming. They kept leaving food. The food sat untouched in the snow, then disappeared under the next fall, then was replaced and sat untouched again. City officials, when they registered the absence at all, registered it as a relief. Fewer complaints, fewer resource demands. The feral cat problem, which had never really been a problem so much as a feature of the city's informal ecology, appeared to have resolved itself quietly under the weight of an extraordinary winter. The city's ecologists would look back on this moment and wish they'd made a different call. Because what was actually happening in those weeks, what the absence of cats was signalling, what the collapse of that small predator layer in the urban food web was making possible, was not a resolution. It was a vacancy. And in ecology, vacancies don't stay empty. Something always moves in to fill the space left behind. The question is never whether. It is only what. For a while, things actually seemed fine. The snow kept falling, the city kept functioning, and the silence where the cats had been was easy to explain away as winter doing what winter does. That didn't last. The Siberian Wildlife Institute had placed its camera traps along the Ob River corridor and the fringe parks at the city's edge in January 2025. And the purpose, at the time, was entirely mundane. Every hard winter pushes wildlife. It is one of the most reliable patterns in Siberian ecology when prey concentrates near human settlement, when the snowpack makes open country hunting prohibitive, when the forest margins offer less than the warm, food-rich edges of a city, animals move. Foxes are the most common visitors. They slip along drainage channels and railway embankments, appearing in suburban gardens with a boldness that surprises residents who have never thought of their city as habitat. Wild boar come too, in the deepest cold, rooting through whatever the snow hasn't buried. The Institute's researchers had seen this pattern before. The camera traps, 12 units deployed across 6 sites, running on motion-triggered infrared sensors, were positioned to document the scale of that encroachment. How many foxes? Which corridors were they using? Were the boar moving in family groups or as solitary individuals? Standard winter monitoring. The kind of data that feeds into city planning reports and wildlife management guidelines and academic papers that accumulate quietly in institutional archives. The cameras ran through January without producing anything remarkable. Fox activity, as expected. A boar sow with 2 juveniles crossing a frozen drainage channel near the southern park boundary on the 14th. Corvids triggering the motion sensors repeatedly, which is the particular frustration of every researcher who has ever deployed a camera trap anywhere near a crow. The data was useful. It was not surprising. And then there was frame 1847 on camera unit 7. The timestamp reads January 29, 2025 at 2:14 in the morning. The temperature outside was minus 28 degrees Celsius. The camera was positioned at the edge of a birch stand where the park boundary meets the first line of apartment blocks, one of those transitional zones that exist in every large Siberian city, where the managed green space simply runs out and the urban fabric begins, and the line between them is less a boundary than a suggestion. The animal that walked through that frame was not a fox. It was large, even accounting for the compression of a wide-angle infrared lens, even knowing that camera traps can distort scale in ways that require careful interpretation. The animal was large. It moved with the particular deliberate weight of a feline that has never needed to hurry, the unhurried shoulder-rolling gait that belongs to cats built for power rather than speed, cats that hunt by ambush and patience rather than pursuit. The ears were tufted, rising to distinct dark points above a broad, slightly flattened head. The paws were enormous, wide and heavily padded in the way that evolution has refined over thousands of years for moving silently across deep snow. The tail was short, almost stubby, carried low. If that sounds bad, keep watching. Because what the researchers at the Siberian Wildlife Institute were looking at, what took several days of careful review, of comparison against morphological databases, of consultation with colleagues who specialize in large feline identification, was a Eurasian lynx. Lynx. A species that had been functionally absent from the Novosibirsk region for more than 40 years. Not rare, not occasionally glimpsed at the extreme edge of its range. Absent, gone from the regional record the way species go when habitat pressure and human expansion push them back past the point of return. The clock was already ticking. The city just couldn't hear it yet. The researchers went back through the full archive from all 12 camera units. Weeks of footage, thousands of triggered frames, the vast majority containing nothing more interesting than wind-moved branches and the occasional startled fox. But they went through it, carefully, frame by frame where necessary. What they found was not one animal. It was not a single individual that had wandered into the city's edge by accident, a biological anomaly, a dispersing juvenile that had lost its bearings. Subsequent footage pulled from 3 separate camera units across 2 different sites, confirmed at least 3 individual links moving independently through the city's fringe zones during January alone. 3 animals, moving on different nights, using different corridors, showing no signs of travelling together, not a family group, not a mother with offspring. 3 separate animals, each making the same calculation that the margins of this city, in this winter, offered something worth approaching for. What it offered, of course, was the vacancy, the collapsed small predator layer, the absence of cats that had gone unremarked for weeks, while city officials quietly noted the drop in complaints. A lynx does not hunt domestic cats because it prefers them. It hunts what is available, what is concentrated, what can be taken with the least expenditure of energy in conditions that punish every wasted calorie. The city's feral cat population, already stressed and thinned by the brutal winter, had become, in the precise ecological sense of the word, a resource. 3 animals confirmed. 3 animals that had, by every available record, no business being anywhere near a city of 1.5 million people. And the footage from January was only the beginning. Nobody had yet looked at February. Nobody had yet checked whether the lynx had stopped at the fringe, or whether they had kept moving inward, following the vacancy deeper into the city's green corridors, closer to the parks, closer to the places where people walked their dogs and children played in the snow. And the boundary between wilderness and urban life had always felt, to the people living there, like something permanent and settled and safe. The researchers who pulled that February footage would not find it reassuring. Dr. Lena Voss had spent the better part of 15 years following large cats through some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet. Snow leopards in the Altai, Pallas's cats on the Mongolian steppe. She had crawled through frozen creek beds at 4 in the morning to retrieve camera trap cards, had spent weeks in field stations without running water, had published papers that most people outside her discipline would never read. She was not easily surprised by what animals did, but when the footage from the city's eastern camera grid landed on her desk in early February 2025, she sat with it for a long time before she said anything to anyone. Voss is a wildlife biologist at the Siberian Wildlife Institute, and her specific focus for the past decade had been large felid behaviour and recolonization, the mechanics of how big cats return to landscapes they have abandoned or been driven from, or simply outgrown. It is a narrow specialty, and she had built her career on careful, incremental work. Peer review, replication, the slow accumulation of evidence before any claim. Professor Andrei Kovalenko came at the same problem from a completely different direction. His background was urban ecology, the study of how wildlife adapts to, exploits, and sometimes thrives inside the infrastructure of human settlement. He had spent years documenting foxes in Moscow, raptors nesting on industrial rooftops, the surprising persistence of small mammal communities inside city parks. He understood, better than most, that cities are not the biological deserts they appear to be. But even Kovalenko had limits to what he expected to find. The 2 researchers had collaborated before, briefly, on a study of corvid populations in Siberian urban corridors. They respected each other. They did not always agree. When the camera trap data began circulating in January 2025, both of them received it through separate channels, and both of them, independently, reached the same initial conclusion. There was something wrong with the images. Not technically wrong. The footage was clear. The timestamps were consistent, but what the images appeared to show was something that neither of them had a professional framework for. Links. Inside the city boundary. Not on the edge. Not in the greenbelt. Inside. Now, Voss could have stopped there. She didn't. She went back through 6 weeks of archived footage from the camera network, cross-referencing timestamps with weather data, with the documented collapse of the feral cat population, with satellite maps of the city's green corridors. The pattern that emerged was not ambiguous. Something large, solitary and feline had been moving through Novosibirsk's outer districts with increasing regularity since at least the third week of December 2024. And it was not moving randomly. It was following the corridors where cat activity had been highest before the disappearances began. The real question is what happened behind closed doors. Because what the data was suggesting, that a Eurasian lynx had not merely wandered into the city, but had, in some functional sense, begun to use it as hunting territory, had no modern precedent in the Russian scientific literature. There were historical accounts, 19th century records of lynx moving through settlements in winter. But nothing in the contemporary era, nothing peer-reviewed, nothing that would survive the scrutiny of a serious journal. Kovalenko later described his first conversation with Voss about the footage as one of the more uncomfortable professional experiences of his career. Not because they argued, because they agreed, and agreeing meant committing to something neither of them could fully defend yet. Voss put it plainly in an interview conducted after the study's publication. She said, and I'm quoting directly, "The data kept telling us something we didn't have a framework to believe yet." That was a working scientist with 15 years of field experience saying that the evidence was outpacing her ability to interpret it. What happened next moved faster than academic science usually moves. By the first week of February 2025, Voss and Kovalenko had formed an emergency research coalition, cross-disciplinary, pulling in specialists from wildlife genetics, urban planning, veterinary science, and remote sensing. The coalition had no formal institutional home. It ran on shared drives and late-night calls, and a collective understanding that whatever was happening in Novosibirsk was happening right now, and waiting for normal grant cycles and committee approvals was not an option. Because speed in science means corners get cut. It means assumptions go unchallenged. It means the pressure to confirm what you think you're seeing can quietly override the discipline to keep asking whether you're wrong. Voss knew this. Kovalenko knew this. The coalition built in checkpoints. Every piece of evidence had to be reviewed by at least 2 researchers from different disciplines before it was accepted into the working dataset. Every alternative explanation had to be formally proposed and formally eliminated. It was slow for an emergency and fast for a study, and the tension between those two realities ran through the entire project. The peer-reviewed paper that Kovalenko led was published in September 2025. It documented, with methodological rigour that makes findings stick, what the camera traps had been suggesting since January. A Eurasian lynx, almost certainly a single adult animal, had established a functional hunting range inside the urban boundary of Novosibirsk during the winter of 2024 to 2025. The study ran to 47 pages. It cited 112 sources. It had been reviewed by 6 independent referees before acceptance. Everything Voss had built was about to work against them. The Eurasian lynx is the largest of the 4 lynx species, and its historical range was, at one point, almost incomprehensibly vast. From the Atlantic coast of Portugal, east across the whole of Europe and Central Asia, through the boreal forests of Siberia, all the way to the Pacific. A ghost spread across an entire continent, moving at night, leaving almost nothing behind. In the Novosibirsk region, that ghost had been absent for approximately 40 years. Habitat loss, hunting pressure, the collapse of prey populations that followed the disruption of the tiger's edge ecosystems in the Soviet era. The lynx didn't vanish dramatically. It thinned. And then it was gone, and people stopped expecting it, and a generation grew up in a city that had no living memory of the animal that had once moved through the forests at its back. Eurasian lynx are solitary and crepuscular. They hunt at dusk and before dawn. Their primary prey in wild settings is roe deer, hares, small ungulates, the same categories of animal that a city's edge, with its parks and greenbelts and unmanaged scrubland, quietly supports. They are capable of covering 20 to 30 kilometres in a single night. They are ambush predators of extraordinary patience. They wait, they watch. They do not commit until the moment is certain. Globally, the IUCN lists the Eurasian lynx as least concern. But regional Russian populations remain fragmented and vulnerable, and the distance between a species' global status and its local reality can be enormous. What returned to Novosibirsk was not a symbol. It was an animal doing what animals do, finding the gap, reading the landscape, following the prey. The cats had vanished. The corridor had opened, and something old enough to know that corridor by instinct had walked back in. We didn't restore the valley. We returned the animal that knew how, and then got out of its way. What changed permanently because of this story is the proof that a wild predator can choose to come back. Subscribe to catch the next comeback.